So my potentially toxic trait is having a soft spot for reading Jane Eyre as a romance, despite being able to side-eye Rochester with my grown-up brain, though I guess there is a reason that dark romances are so popular, despite the fact I don't really have much familiarity with that world. And don't get me wrong, this is not a not like other girls moment. I realize that's kind of baked into the formula of Jane Eyre, but I also really appreciate a lot of the modern interpretations that have complicated this relationship. In some ways, should the endings of Jane Eyre and Viet be flip-flopped for reader satisfaction? Maybe. And in that vein of intertextuality with Jane Eyre and complicating the story as we know it, we have Escaping Mr. Rochester by L.L. McKinney, which is a young adult retelling, reimagining of Jane Eyre through a Black sapphic lens, which also selfishly feels very fitting in some ways because I, as a reader, first encountered Jane Eyre as a young adult, and I think there's a lot in it that is very appealing to young adults. While it's a different Bronte sister, there's a reason Wuthering Heights was the book that Bella was obsessed with in Twilight. It kind of lends itself to those wild romanticizations, and so this is in direct conversation with those instincts and directly contradictory to those instincts in a really interesting way. And first and foremost, if you've been with me a second, if you have, much appreciated, you probably know that I'm very interested in retellings and reimaginings and things that are in conversation with each other, but that it's a really difficult, a kind of deceptively difficult thing to pull off because so many of these retellings that we've been getting recently don't feel like they're taking complete ownership of that story or that material, or that they have something particularly new to offer to the conversation. And I will say this, I do not get that from this interpretation. And this is not McKinney's first foray into reimaginings. She also has, I believe it's a duology, maybe it's a trilogy, that is an Alice in Wonderland retelling. I read the first book in that series, I believe, on audio, and I'm going to be completely honest, I don't remember much of it. But there's a clear history of engaging with classic texts and revitalizing them for contemporary young adult audiences that I think is really successful in this book, in that it really makes this story its own. If you were going in for a beat-for-beat Jane Eyre retelling with some sapphic themes thrown on top, that is not what you're going to get here. This is not like the Jane Eyre Vampire Hunter book where you just kind of throw those themes on top. This is really taking the original story, the original kind of conceit, and twisting it to what the story is trying to accomplish. So we have the main things that are the same. Jane is a governess coming in to take care of Adele. Again, blanket reminder that I don't speak French, so apologies for any kind of bad pronunciation of some of these things, especially Adele's name, but we have that. And then of course there is the Bertha of it all. We have Rochester's wife locked in the attic. And one of the main distinct parts of this book is Bertha getting a voice. Now, you may be like, it's not really distinct in the sense that we have White Sargasso Sea, which again, I have not read that either since high school. I read Jane Eyre, and I believe I read them very close together because I had an English teacher who very much was kind of guiding my reading at that point because I was told that I couldn't keep reading Buffy novelizations during self-selected reading, which was ultimately for the best for me because I discovered things like Jane Eyre, and it's where I started with Austen and eventually moved into Dickens too. Not that either is better than the other, but I needed someone to kind of point me in that direction. However, that piece begs the question too, if we're looking at this for a young adult audience, what young adults are going to be intimately familiar with the source material? So you don't really need a beat-for-beat retelling because a lot of these young readers probably have not read the original. So this may spark an interest that causes them to go back and read it. It's not going to be in line with what they've got here at all by any means, but it's a thought experiment that makes me very interested in how these things are approached, especially when you think about it in context of things like Macmillan's classic retellings that we've been getting over the past number of years. So there's definitely conversations happening around this, and I'm very interested in what those discussions look like. But nevertheless, so we are starting with Jane going to Thornfield, which, if you are familiar with the text of Jane Eyre, is pretty important because we have a lot of backstory with Jane before we get to Thornfield in Jane Eyre. It is a very intimate character study in a lot of ways. There's a lot of like tragic backstory, and we do get some reference to some of that here, particularly Jane's relationship with Helen, which has been queered here in a really delightful way, I think. I think that that is the kind of impetus for everything, because I think you really can look and interpret Helen and Jane's relationship through that lens, or think about what could have been there in a lot of ways. And so that is kind of our foundation for Jane as a character in this book. We get some references to Lowood, the fact that she doesn't want to return, but it doesn't feel like we really get the full sense of how bad things were there in the original novel. And we also don't get reference to like her cousin that was a terror when she was younger. So it really is kind of her springing forth into this new environment, which can be hard because then we have to establish this whole character in this very much new environment. And the kind of gothic nature of Thornfield is really heightened here in the sense that it is really emphasizing how it's falling apart and breaking down, and the darkness, and very much symbolic of the kind of state of things in this house, absolutely. But while it's not a beat for beat retelling, and we deviate pretty significantly over the course of the book, we do still get kind of references and nods to things that readers and enjoyers of Jane Eyre would either expect or at least appreciate. We have, of course, the I am no bird. We almost have to, I would think, reference that in some way in something associated with Jane Eyre, because it's one of the most iconic lines in Jane Eyre and in Bronte. We do not get, at least that I could find or think back, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think we got a reader I married him. Very obviously, within the course of this book, we're not going to get a reader I married him, and we'll dig into that a little bit more later, but I don't think we get any twist on that. However, we of course get a lot of references to fire, which was probably absurdly amusing to me, not because of anything in this book, because when I was a bookseller, I was obsessed with like baby lit books, and I think there is a specific baby lit line, but I don't know that that's what I'm referencing here. There were a couple of lines. One was kind of more a classic retelling or kind of condensing of classic literature into board books for kids with kind of felt-like kind of illustrations, and then the other was using classics to introduce concepts to kids in the framework or context of those classics in a way that was probably more amusing for adults. And I used to love selling both of these kinds of books. However, the Jane Eyre one was very interesting in that it like started with the concept of fire and destruction and like things that just don't necessarily make sense for like a child's bedtime story. However, it's of course incredibly important to the story of Jane Eyre, and so we do have that exploration of fire here. Another moment that I caught, again, caveat, there are probably many moments I didn't catch because it has been a second since I read Jane Eyre, was it talks about, alas, I don't have my crystal ball on hand. Pretty innocuous statement in and of itself. You're like, Melody, okay. However, there is that scene in Jane Eyre where Rochester comes in disguised as a fortune teller. Also interesting that that seems to be kind of alluded to because that's one of the scenes in Jane Eyre that doesn't hold up the same today. So we have all these little nods, but narratively we are following both Jane and Bertha moving back and forth from their points of view. And what I found really notable in Jane's point of view was how kind of centered her anger was here. And I think that's a particularly interesting choice because it does root itself back textually in the original text. Part of what we are led to believe, at least according to my kind of distance interpretation of Jane Eyre, and I've read it a couple times, but long ago, is that Rochester is partly drawn to Jane because she is a little bit more enigmatic. She challenges him occasionally. And in terms of the conception and the framework of this text, the fact that Jane sees right through things is immediately evident, but also she is guided by this kind of anger, which is empowering in the sense that she never has to apologize for her anger. She never feels bad for her anger. She is allowed to know when she is being taken advantage of, when something isn't right. She's allowed to have these messier emotions that oftentimes are things that especially young people are told they kind of have to work through and that we shouldn't sit in anger. But Jane is allowed to have this anger, and it's not always righteous. It often is, but this idea that she's allowed to feel these things. And this exploration of anger also carries over into the portrayal of Bertha, which I think is the hardest kind of point of entry in this book, in the sense of what we have from Bertha in the original text, kind of our modern conception and kind of challenging of what we have of Bertha in the original text comes from Wide Sargasso Sea, and so this has to be independent of that. And by the nature of Bertha's circumstance, we have a young woman trapped, locked in a room, and so there's a limited amount of potential action there in terms of dramatically, because she is contained in this space. However, especially in relation to her anger, I think that containment, that sense of being trapped, those helpless feelings, it's fueled well through this emotional interpretation and this exploration of this anger, this dangerous simmering anger that you could feel ready to explode at any moment. And in her case, incredibly righteous at all times based on her circumstance. And in terms of this idea of this emotion being contained, it is explored through the idea that she cries when she's angry, which is completely normal. And I love that we're exploring that, this idea that people cry for different reasons, that extreme emotion can bring that out in us. And I think that's important just for the emotional intelligence exploration of teens, this idea, especially when you're a teen, that you're going to have these responses when you feel something intensely, and teens usually are feeling something intensely. So we do have these emotional interpretations. We start with her as she's kind of trying to break free from this room. So she always has a dramatic action. She's always scheming. She's always trying, which textually roots itself too, because we know that Bertha made herself known, that she escaped from her room. We have this, but then we get to see this different side of it, and we are also then transported back to how she got here in the first place. It does take us a second to go back. It kind of establishes us very firmly at Thornfield before it goes back to what happened. How did Bertha get here? And then it looks at her as a socialite from New Orleans and how Rochester came over and wooed her, and then when she got back to Thornfield, how things changed basically immediately. And so it really is looking at Rochester as a kind of mustachioed villain in some ways. Before we dive into Rochester though, let's talk about the kind of historical context of this novel just a little bit. We're not going to go deep. However, I think it's important to talk about because we have both a Bertha and a Jane here that are Black women, and especially when Bertha spends a significant part of the second half of the novel literally in chains, that is something that we are going to read through a very specific lens, I think. And I don't think the book doesn't want us to consider that in our reading, but I think it is kind of a secondary layer of interpretation because the book is taking place in a kind of alternative history timeline. There are both gentry of color in England. In like one scene we get where Rochester is mingling amongst his peers, and Bertha is a socialite in New Orleans. Additionally, there is a reference to a Queen Amelia that's a kind of throwaway in the text, which kind of clues us in that this isn't completely rooted in actual history as we would think of it. But it is, again, impossible to kind of remove some of these visuals from the history as we know it. And so there is a little bit of buffering there in terms of allowing young readers to kind of have that escape of a fantasy historical fiction in some ways, while also still grappling with the very real weight of some of these images. And that really even further emphasizes kind of the horrors Bertha is dealing with. And the horrors here are never questioned. We never have reason to complicate or mistrust Bertha's state of mind, even having been a prisoner for essentially a year according to the narrative. So it's a very righteous anger. It's very clear what the objective for these two women will be. It does take a second for them to kind of join forces, for Jane to come across Bertha, which I like that we're not rushing things. I like that we're getting to kind of feel the sinister nature of the place in some ways. It's a little bit slower, but then we end up rushing the romantic developments between Bertha and Jane a little bit to my interpretation, and I would have liked to kind of draw that out just a little bit more, but extenuating circumstances being what they are. However, it's interesting because from the perspective of the narrative, we are again getting it from Jane and Bertha's point of view. It is very much their story. However, the title of the book is Escaping Mr. Rochester, which is interesting twofold. One, because it makes it very clear from the outset, there is no possibility of misinterpretation that Rochester is the bad guy here, which again kind of goes back to that kind of mustachioed villain interpretation, but also in some ways it makes it interesting because it is somewhat centering him in a way, and I understand it because it's about their power in escaping that, but it is an interesting kind of kernel of thought in some ways. Now, when I call Rochester a mustachioed villain, I'm not being literal there. I don't remember any direct references to his grooming habits in this book. Correct me if you caught them, but the fact that he's kind of flat in his villainy. And on one hand, I understand, because again, this does help shift the focus to Jane and Bertha, because in that flatness, there's not as much of an opportunity for nuance or an exploration there, which again, I understand in terms of what this narrative seems to be wanting to accomplish. However, there were times I thought it was kind of a disservice to the story because it is repeated again and again, especially from Bertha, how Edward Rochester is able to kind of wheel you in and he's able to kind of woo people and get them on his side, and how he is so dangerous in that because people believe this kind of facade. However, we never see the facade. We get references to shifts in him, this kind of more sinister tinge in terms of how Jane is able to see through him right away. And there is that attempt to show that more outward facade in terms of, again, the scene where he is mingling with his peers. However, we never believe it as a reader, and I think that there is something really interesting in exploring that nuance a little bit more, because then he's even more dangerous. And not to be after school special about it, but then it also gives teens this kind of look at this more complicated villainy and how someone who may present as altruistic and charming may have ulterior motives. And paradoxically, I think presenting him as such a flat villain sometimes took the immediacy of the danger away, which sounds wrong, I know, because we get a long list of his crimes. Though to be clear, not a literal list, we're discovering them through the action, but still. And this could be just my interpretation. So if you read that a different way, please let me know, because I'm very interested into how other readers may have seen that working within the narrative. And that being said, that goes across the board on this one. I would be very interested to hear how you think this works as a reimagining rather than a retelling, I would say, based on the fact that it's not, beat for beat in its exploration. Not that a retelling has to be beat for beat, but you know what I mean. It is going in a decidedly different direction on purpose. And there are times it is incredibly successful in that. And again, I really commend McKinney for taking charge of this narrative, taking ownership of this narrative. There were admittedly also times I thought it could push a little further, have a little bit more nuance, but I think ultimately it was a really interesting entry into the canon of books that are in conversation with Jane Eyre. So again, let me know what you're thinking, feeling. As always, I really appreciate you being interested at all in my thoughts. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you feel like it. If you do feel like it is much appreciated. But most importantly, as always, read something good, and yeah, bye.